Thank you, Stephen, for your kind words. I'm aware of the fact that we are running out of time, and I'm here to speak about space. I wouldn't know that I can speak about space or non-space, or perhaps neither space nor non-space, perhaps both. My paper is titled Celebrating the Difference in Search of a Common Space. As you might notice, or if you are very perceptive, you would realize that is a paradox in the very title itself. That is only to show how paradoxical my paper is to be. We are speaking on the one hand about difference, on the other hand, there is a common space. Is there anything common at all? And that's the paradox I am going to place before you. Years ago, when I was a student here, I came across a book written by one David Knight, a Jesuit, who worked in Africa. And then in his book, he narrates his experience as a novice in the African continent. And then I just want to read out his experience. To begin with, all hermeneutics becomes important not because it reveals some meaning, sometimes it hides some meaning. I'm just reading his experience. This is what he says. In that totally different world of 20 years ago, the children of poor black families surrounding our novitiate used to come to our kitchen for food. A brother would distribute the leftovers from the community meal. One day a child asked him, "Brother, how much they pay you here?" "Oh, they don't pay me anything. I have a vow of poverty." "What is that?" "Well, that means anything I want, I go to the Father Superior and ask for it. Food, clothes, money for a movie and so forth. But I don't get paid." "You mean anything you want? You just ask for it and they give it to you?" "Yes, that's it." "And how do you call that?" "That is a vow of poverty." A long silence. "Brother, where can I get one of those poverties?" It's a beautiful event, very meaningful event. I wouldn't know what kind of meaning you derive from this. Perhaps each one of you may come up with different kind of questions responding to this event that is narrated by Knight. Perhaps, is there an understanding of the word poverty? Is there a misunderstanding? Are they very different in their approach to life and reality? Is there anything common at all in the conversation they had? I think that is a big challenge. If that is a challenge in everyday, ordinary event, I think it becomes a greater challenge with regard to deep experiences of human life. It can be religious, meta-religious, even deep friendship. The meaning making is not univocal. We don't share a homogeneous space. I think that is the crux of the issue. Derrida, interestingly, in response to a debate in the continental West between Heideggerians and Levinasians, if I were to put that, Heideggerian in a way, Heidegger representing the Greek tradition, and Levinas, in a way representing the Jewish tradition, raised an interesting question. Are we Greeks? Are we Jews? Perhaps are we both? If I may add a note to that, are we Greeks in terms of being philosophers here? Are we Jews in terms of certain religious heritage that we have inherited from Judaism? Are we Indians? The reality in which most of you and I are born into. Perhaps I thought this may be the good starting point. I thought I should take up a comparison, perhaps not a very superficial one, not really going into different words and details of it, but then to see how there can be a difference, yet a space or a non-space that can bring together, that can hinge this difference, without, however, not subsuming the difference, without reducing it to some kind of uniformity. And the choice I made, of course, I made a poet. Therefore, I am moving from a kind of mythos, logos, and pathos to a kind of poeticos, if I might say so. And that poet is, whose date can be very, very flexible in India. The question of history is very, very flexible, as you know. He is dated anywhere in the before Christ era or after Christ era. I think it is pretty much the agreement or the consensus is that somewhere around 6th, 7th century he lived. A poet by name Thirumular, a mystic. And I am not taking so much a Greek philosophical text, rather I am taking a Jewish mystical tradition called Kabbalah, the Luria and Lurianic Kabbalah. And I'm trying to raise some questions from there. I may not probably read the whole text. The reason why I choose is both somehow dwell on a certain experience, a deep experience, often religious, sometimes meta-religious. And any experience, if it is ineffable, a mystical experience is even more ineffable. It is almost inexpressible. And in fact, Thirumular himself designates this mystical experience as something the Indians would call a yoga samadhi. He evokes an idea of infinite space. An infinite space which is neither inside nor outside, but perhaps between the two. He also evokes the idea of the veiled depth, a depth that is veiled. An inexpressible consciousness, a consciousness of a non-dual experience. And the mystical experience, in fact, is for most Indians, Indian schools of thought, is one that leads you to a state of liberation. Of course, we have got various words in the Indian tradition to designate that, like moksha, mukti, and nirvana. If you are a Buddhist, then you would say nibbana. But interestingly, Thirumular uses a Tamil word, vidu, which literally means home. And liberation, therefore, is a homecoming. A coming back to oneself. Paradoxically, it may seem. On the one hand, you need to liberate yourself. On the other hand, it is a coming back to oneself. But coming back to oneself after having renounced certain narrow confines of your self-identity. That's what is liberation. It's a homecoming. And it explains this in terms of a space, an eternal space, or sometimes called pure space. Someone who experiences this liberation inhabits a space which is not in time, which is a kind of eternity and eschatology. And eschatology, as you know, an eschaton is never present. A future that will probably never get present. A future which would remain a future. And therefore, it would not get limited itself to any historical time. A future that is always to come. And this space, interestingly, Thirumular would say, is an indeterminate vacuum. The Indian scholars would use the Indian word shunya, shunyata. And this is often considered as a kind of emptiness. But it's not emptiness in the ordinary sense of the term. Perhaps it can be best translated as some kind of non-substantiality, indescribable by concepts, beyond the matrix of space and time, and the abandoning of binary oppositions, every duality, and discursive thought. To that extent, this indeterminate vacuum is nothingness, yet it is fullness. It is not a negation of what something is, but a negation of every determination. It is an undifferentiated state. It is not a theory, not even an end of theory about reality. It is just a state of bliss, of tranquility. There is a loss of concept of I, me, in a cosmic consciousness without limit, a supreme bliss. Interestingly, this also evokes the idea of absence. You know, Meister Eckhart, the famous German mystic, once said, the joy of getting knowledge as long as you live, and the joy of every creature who gets this knowledge is much less compared to the joy of that pure knowledge which is concealed, which is absent. In fact, this question of presence, absence, the space and non-space, and the space between this, I think that is what something very interesting that we need to try and see what hermeneutics can do. An experience like a loving union, the profound experience, a kind of mystical experience. Thirumoolar would say, this cannot be put into words. And a mystic passes on to a silent language in the heart. In a certain sense, you transcend yourself. There is an experience of transcendence in this loving union between male, female, husband, wife, and yet you are very much present to yourself. There is whole transcendence, dimension, immanence aspect that is at once brought together. An inexplicable bliss, tranquility. It is also called by Thirumoolar, I'm just translating, I'm not giving the original words, it is beyond the beyond. There is a tension between the impossibility of expressing this experience, yet the desire somehow to verbalize this. Hence, this paradoxical expression beyond the beyond. After all, language becomes nebulous, especially when it comes to profound experience. And that is why Thirumoolar would say, in such an experience of loving union, you begin to say, that copula, and, doesn't follow the logical order of any grammar. Because then you would be ending up in kind of equating I and you. That's not the point. It is not of the logical order, but of the mystical order. And he says, this is the only way perhaps you can understand the famous Tattvamasi of the Upanishad. You are that, without which, in the logical order, you would be equating the you and that supreme. If at all there is fragmentation, of course, Thirumoolar does not subscribe to a monistic view. That is why this whole idea I am trying to bring. I am you is not an equation, but something beyond. And if at all there is a fragmentation, that is precisely because of the order of creation as the Lurianic Kabbalists would call it. And in fact, the Western world knew Luria and Lurianic Kabbalah only from Sholem. We are indebted to him for making present this Jewish Kabbalah tradition to us, available by writing it in European languages. Otherwise, to read in Hebrew would be almost impossible for most of us, perhaps, except for some scholars. And Sholem would say, there is a paradox, the paradox of the idea of infinite God, which the Kabbalists call Ein Sof, because the Ein Sof, which evokes the idea of infinite, is at once the Ein, the nothingness. The true essence of Ein Sof, I keep the word Ein Sof, but remember it is evoking the idea of infinite and the infinite God in the Jewish sense of the term, leaves no space for creation. Because it is not possible to imagine a space that is not already inhabited by God. Because then the whole question of infinity becomes finite. In a sense, the differentiation, which is called Sitzum, and Ein Sof, there is a kind of paradoxical situation. Because if Ein Sof is infinite and Sitzum, which is the cause, or which is the result in a way of creation of this fragmentation or multiplicity, if you want to call that, of finite, then how do you hold them together? In a way, the Lurianic Kabbalists underscored the differentiation of Sitzum by identifying it with the judgment. Judgment, not necessarily in the Christian sense of the term, but the word used is din, which is the source of all moral, spiritual, and material distinction. The beings can exist separately from divine fullness because their union of Ein Sof is constantly deferred in space and in time. If Ein Sof was fully present, space and time disappear, and that is the important point. If Ein Sof is fully present, say space and time would disappear, and the differential matrix that allows the distinction of individual beings would really fade. And in fact, I just wanted to make a point about Derrida here, but I'm afraid maybe that would be a comparison that might lead to an explanation that I go maybe in the discussion. If needed, I will take it up. And therefore, Lurianic Kabbalists believe that space and time, as well as beings, they're all constituted by this Sitzum, the principle of difference, and therefore also a principle of lack. An idea I'm sure Victor would like very much, because there is an element of absence that is stepping in. In Lurianic Kabbalah, the essence of being full is the absence. That is to say, the concealment and the contraction of Ein Sof, the infinite divine. The Sitzum creates the absence of the heart, giving the individual being a space, a gap, that makes possible finite entities and their properties. This is in fact defined by a relative absence, the absence by the concealment of the divine light. Imagine it is an infinite divine light. This leads to Sitzum, the assertion that any finite comprises the order of presence and absence. For the Kabbalists, the very nature of finite and temporal existence is to be impregnated with the absence. They identify absence with the divine trait that brought judgment, din, and distinctions in a finite world. Most of you who are familiar with Judaism, at least through Christian optics, you would know there is a hibernation of God in their theology, that absence. There is an amount of political importance there, but I am remaining within the poetics of imagination without stepping to the politics for a moment. For Lurianic Kabbalists, time is both the vehicle of Sitzum, but it is also the result of Sitzum. Full presence is only possible for a timeless God. Since human person is in time, it is essential that the presence for him or her always consists of the absence. What is at a certain time, that is to say, in this time is constituted by what it is not. It was in the past and what it will be in the future. There is a Heideggerian Derridian aspect here. Those of you can connect to that. Its very identity is constituted by a past that is no more and a future which has not yet happened. It is in this perspective that we can understand the Lurianic thought. That Sitzum has generated the finite and boundaries, the conditions of death and even ignorance. Indeed, the same living entities who are finite, who have to embrace death. If finitude was neither remote, and if finitude is bereft of ignorance, especially of the fullness of the living God, it could no longer be finite. The lack of consciousness is inscribed in the very essence of finitude. And the principal character word, the cause, if you want to use the traditional word for this, is Ein Sof. Because Ein Sof creates a world by an act of concealment, of hiding. Of course, this concealment for Lurianic Kabbalists was made through the Hebrew alphabet and language in general. Let us take flesh in Torah because the prototype of creation itself results from a linguistic process. The scripture, which is the divine revelation for creation, is also a concealment of the divine truth. Which means revelation inaugurates concealment. And concealment, this revelation concealment dynamics also inaugurates life. Creation from a certain perspective is manifestation, realization and perfection of the divine truth. But from another perspective it is alienation, denial, delusion, deception and the like. This is of course in the Western categories called the coincidentia oppositorum. Now this ambivalence of this coincidentia oppositorum between supposedly contradictory ideas in thought and speech is clearly symbolized in the Kabbalah. Luria argues the divine principle of the world is both Ein Sof, the infinite, and Ein, the absolute nothingness, or the Shunyata. The creation is both emanation and contraction. The Ein Sof is the creator of the world, is itself constantly created through human actions, whether they are ethical or spiritual. Such as an ambivalence is found in all religious experience. There is a double dimension which is fascinating, but at the same time frightening. And this is often, said by different people, including Otto. He would say how religious experience can be very ambivalent. We have a lot of such examples in the Indian tradition. I'm just skipping that a while. And for Luria, the realization of Ein Sof is still linked to the second coincidentia oppositorum between creation and destruction, symbolized by what he calls Shevirat Akeli. Ein Sof is fully itself when differentiation is not made. Source and creator of all, Ein Sof, however, becomes itself only through a rupture, with the result of the world which is created, but which is also in need of restoration. Thus, Ein Sof depends for its existence on humanity. That is a clear coincidentia oppositorum here, because on the one hand, human depends on God to come to be, and on the other hand, it seems to be that the God, the source of all, is dependent on human to come to be. That reminds me of yesterday's paper about Karne we had, Okay, that's a poetics there. Let us leave it at that. I want to now conclude by bringing in a Greek dimension to this. In fact, in this whole coincidentia oppositorum, we cannot but evoke Plato's idea of chora. Plato clearly makes a distinction between the intelligible and the sensible forms, things that are visible and tangible. But Plato also introduces a third kind, the chora, a place which is not a place, a non-spatial space, from which all things grow. Very often, Plato uses very many metaphors to designate that, including the metaphor of a mother, including a metaphor of a nurse, and perhaps sometimes he ends up speaking like receptacle, almost like the Descartes extensio. But Plato is quick to clarify that by naming, he is not trying to somehow limit its essence. After all, it is a space, non-space. It is neither logos nor mythos, neither being nor non-being, neither sensible nor intelligible, present nor absent, neither active nor passive. It is something that we cannot name. Perhaps is it a danger or a blessing? I wouldn't know, that we cannot name. For Derrida, who would develop this idea of Cora later in his writing, he would say there is two types of oscillation. The oscillation between the double exclusion and the participation. Derrida says this oscillation can be called anachorism. Cora, as Derrida points out, is both older, perhaps ever recent. This anachronism means Cora is the receptacle of all things, and yet she receives without receiving. It contains all things, yet she does not. The only name we can give are the sensible and the intelligible realities. We cannot even name Cora. And Derrida would draw a parallel between the Cora and its difference, or difference to be more correct. Derrida would say Cora is the nickname of difference. It is a desertified space. It is not a promised land, but a desert. However, not a desert of revelation, but a desert in the desert. Something that is impossible, but that makes everything possible. It gives rise to every singularity as different. It is thus the possibility of opening up. It is the possibility of gift itself, an impossible possibility. And it is precisely because of this we can then try to have a meaningful relation to the aliens. I'm not speaking about the aliens in the extraterrestrial world, the aliens here, strangers, in all possible categories, including sexual, national, social, and political. And it is from this poetics of imagination that we can pave way for a politics of difference, a politics of, in a certain sense, emancipation. Thank you.